leave. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Moss, for letting us have this instruction course. So without much further ado, let's start with our course, which is medical legal implications and how to avoid them. Since we are in this day and age where the patient first thinks not whether I will get my eyesight back or not, the next first step he thinks is, if I don't get my eyesight, whom should I blame? So the first person they think of is the doctor. So we are always in the line of fire. So the thing is that we'll have to safeguard ourselves, maybe not practice extremely defensive medicine, but at least we should know what all things to look for and when. So I would like to ask Dr. Ashish Bachao to start the proceedings. He's a senior anterior segment surgeon. His specialization is cornea and refractive surgery. He's been into practice for n number of years and has got a huge practice behind him to back what he's saying. He's going to tell us how to handle these medical legal implicities in refractive surgery. Over to you, Ashish.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. So here we are at the outset. I would like to thank Moss for giving us this opportunity, as Anand said, to present this course. I will be talking about medical legal aspects in refractive surgery. I do not have any financial interest from this presentation. There were those days when doctors were considered as next to the god, and there was a general belief that most of them are life and in our case side savers. However, things have changed rapidly around us. Most of us are looked around very suspiciously in spite of the knowledge that we share and the skills and techniques that we bring to the table. Even despite this amount of specialization and our best efforts, we still invariably have many allegations made against us in the court of law. It is a general belief that doctors do not accept cases in which they do not have mastered, and if they are caught into a litigation, the medical council takes away our licenses. We do not have any other business or profession to bring food to the table. Having said that, laser visor correction, as we call it, or LASIK surgery, is the most widely performed surgery in the world. We perform various iterations of it with the excimer laser, whether we do it LASIK, PRK, LASIK, and in these days, femtosecond LASIK and SMILE surgery. Even though the number of them are performed widely, there can be chances or instances where the outcomes can be optimal sometimes, which in turn leads to a very disgruntled, unhappy, and unsatisfied patient who by some means or the other takes you to the court of law, files a case against you. There are many instances when many of our colleagues have been booked for things which were not really in their control. Some things were there in their control. Let's have a look at these cases one by one. There was an instance where a patient following LASIK surgery for high myopia underwent toric implantable lens implantation for an unsatisfied result. The disgruntled patient put a litigation and claimed a sum of 60 million plus as compensation. This was recently a case that was fought. Thankfully, the court did not agree to such an exorbitant claim, claiming that the boy completed his higher education and was doing well in life, and he was very active. So thankfully, the court did not accept this exorbitant 60 million case as a compensation. My slide is stuck. Yes, case number 2 was again talking about consent. Many a times we do take consents, but in this particular instance, it was not properly mentioned. The documentation was inadequate. Patients did not have a preoperative investigations and counselings that was adequately documented, and the consent was not taken up. Courts do not look at a report or a medical documents which does not have any of these documents correctly, especially if there is no informed consent. So we have to be very careful where the consent form is missing. Professional indemnity is another area where most of us do not place much importance to it these days. Insurance of a few lakhs is useless in today's era where compensations are more than 10 million plus. Even as far as back as 2002, this case was about happening in Hyderabad. LASIK, there was compensation claimed of 10 million for not informing a small thing like striae, which can develop on the LASIK flap after laser surgery. So the doctors ourselves do not actually adequately protect the protect ourselves in terms of having a professional indemnity claim, which should be on the higher side, especially now that we all do refractive surgeries. So the question comes, why there are so many cases against us? Are there higher expectations that we are not able to fulfill for the patient? Is there a mismatch? Are we ourselves to be blamed for saying that, oh, this just takes 5 minutes and you will see immediately after 10 minutes and things like that? Or belittling each and every one of us, including our peers, saying that, oh my God, I have the latest laser. What about you? I'm a better LASIK person. What about you? Excessive and not so true advertising. And finally, this all boils down to a mismatch between a patient outcome versus patient expectations. In addition to that, when we do not explain the risk factors adequately or not including an adequate history, taking what is the outcome of surgery, and if there is a chance of complications and how it will be treated, that are not mentioned to the patient is what even intensifies this mismatch. Coming to consent, carrying a consent without carrying out a surgery without an informed consent can result into criminal as well as a civil liability for paying compensation. So whatever the case, we have to take adequate consent for any procedure, any small or large risk that may occur with that procedure. And the patient would want to know if the procedure was refused, we have to also document why it was refused. In layman's language, it should be informed. We do not criticize other previous physicians' actions and maintain a user-friendly approach and access to the patient at all the times. In the court of law, our document that works with us for all the time is a medical report or the patient's medical report. It is the number one witness that will save us. So in any case, we have to document what was the treatment, what was the examination, note any changes to the chart and reasons for change. So the key here is correct documentation. In also along with the documentation, it is the clear history that should be taken. So any previous ocular symptoms, treatments, and surgeries. In this case, especially laser vision correction, dry eye plays a very important role, which might after a laser surgery might worsen the nerves which were cut on the ocular surface, which can increase the symptoms of dry eye. So small issue like dry eye should also be communicated to the patient that this might get exacerbated going forward. So clear communication in the key, as well as boiling down expectations and counseling of the patient is the key, which includes good examination if you notice any scar, dystrophy, or recurrent corneal erosions. Especially in a case of PRK, it is going to be important to tell the patient that you might have some amount of more healing time. In addition to that, lifestyle factors should also be explained to the patient. Patients who want to join the armed forces, navies, and air force also require a good vision, and they come to you for getting a laser vision surgery, saying that, doctor, I need to do get 6/6. But we have to mention to these patients that there is going to be a chance that some amount of vision might be remaining, so that they do not end up taking you to the court again. A longer conversation in case of middle-aged patients, because in younger patients, the outcome is going to be good for a laser visual correction. But for a middle-aged patient, we have to tell them it might be just near-dependent or far-dependent correction. Therefore, middle-aged patients, there might be a chance that they may still need spectacles for some distances after this surgery. So managing complications, managing communication, and managing expectation is the key here. We have to do, as we all do, thorough examination and explain to the patient, especially in terms of what the general health is and how it is going to affect your outcome after surgery. Say, for example, autoimmune disease, which conditions target collagens, it might be an issue. Any patient might turn up with causes of corneal melting. So these also have to be told to the patient. In addition to what exact examination that we do, everything has to be documented well, whether it is the tear film, dry eye, evaporative, non-evaporative, corneal dystrophies, pupil size, and dilated retinal examination. The golden rule that we would like everyone to follow is practice it ourselves to reduce medico-legal complications. We do not do to your colleagues what you do not wish them to do to you. Avoid cheeky remarks, criticisms. Recognize that complications will always occur in the best of hands. Any surgeon that who says does not have complications probably does not do that amount of high volume surgery. And do not say to the patient that you are the best person and nobody else would have done it any otherwise. So communication with the public must be accurate. We should avoid false, untrue, deceptive, or misleading information through statements in the media, testimonials, and we should stay away from paid news and always be upfront about our own complications and how we are going to treat it. But if you're already somebody has filed a case against you, the key here is documentation. Always document what the findings are, how you're going to treat it, what is the plan of your action. Involve a team of super specialist doctors who are going to treat it. Treat the complication as per the standard available or refer to a person in position of authority. Follow up regularly. Needless to say, you have to have at least a minimum of 50 lakh professional indemnity insurance for a person who does high volume refractive surgery, LASIK case. And always ensure that you have support from local bodies like IME and AMCs. In case if there is a DLK or flap related issues, always document the plan of management and have good follow-ups. And when in doubt, always seek review, refer to a senior surgeon and hospital and involve multiple surgeons or hospitals to safeguard you. Uh, eh, there have been cases where it was analyzed that analysis of all the claims shows that liability arises from a delay in diagnosis or delay in treatment, including a delay in referring to the patient to a specialist. So if we follow all these rules, we are going to be in a much better shape. This is also corroborated by Chief Justice of Indian Bench, who said that a doctor is not guilty of negligence, especially in laser refractive surgeries, if he has acted in accordance with practice accepted as a proper standard by a responsible body, which in our case is MOS or AIOS. It is also held that in the realms of diagnosis and treatment, there is also ample genuine scope of differences of opinion, and a doctor is not negligent on those grounds as well. So once the case is diagnosed, it is going to go to an investigating officer who will obtain an independent and competent medical opinion, preferably from a doctor in government service who is qualified in that branch of medicine. And he's supposed to give you an impartial and unbiased opinion, applying the primary test to the facts, which is again corroborated by Chief Justice of India and the bench of Supreme Court. So to reiterate and to take home points, especially in medico-legal issues in refractive surgeries, clear communication in the key. Consent and documentation is very important. Consent preferably in the patient's own local language and signed by a witness as well. We have to own our complications and be very forthright about it. Tell to the patient and say that you're going to be treating him or her in the best of your ability. Always involve your seniors, a team of specialists, and effective counseling of how the plan of treatment is going to go forward. And needless to say, a good professional indemnity insurance and support from local bodies like IMA, MOS, and All India Ophthalmic Society. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ashish, for that wonderful talk. So
Uh,
what we will, yeah.
Yeah, I think before Anand sir can go for his talk, I would like to introduce Anand sir. Anand sir is the head of department of Vitreoretina in Bacholi Eye Hospital. He's the senior consultant associated with Fortis Eye Hospital and Shushruta Eye Hospital. Apart from that, he has his own private practice in central Mumbai. Over to you, Anand sir, please.
Thank you, Sarvesh. But I think in the interest of time, we'll have all the talks, and if there are questions, we'll take them at the end.
Sure, sir.
So the medico-legal aspects of counseling in ROP. So ROP right now, why is it so important? Because there are a lot of vitreoretinal surgeons coming up. So I think the most common subspecialty right now in ophthalmology is vitreoretinal surgery, followed by pediatric ophthalmologists. So if you see in Thane itself, there are 20 of each. So we should be well versed in these things so that we can counsel them properly and have a good understanding of what not to do in these cases. So I'll be talking about a few of these cases. So this is a 30-weeker born in August 1996. Look at the time frame. It's a 1996 case. The government hospital for children and women in Chennai, where it was born. The neonatal experts and pediatricians did not warn the parents about ROP. The child developed stage 5 ROP operated 4 times. The patient's parents took the child to US and got the child operated, but the surgery was not successful and it resulted in complete blindness. The case was filed under Consumer Protection Act in 1998, where the National Consumer Dispute Redressal Commission said that 20 lakhs should be good and 30 lakhs should be given for future treatment. So, and awarded 5 lakhs compensation more. So the parents were not satisfied with this. They appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then made these hospitals responsible and had rupees 1.38 crores as compensation and 42 lakhs as reimbursement of medical expenses. So the total toll on this government hospital was 1.8 crores. So it ruled that the baby was blinded by medical negligence in 1996, and 1.8 crores compensation was ordered in 2015. So the thing to remember is that ROP treatment, you might be thinking that this child I have seen them 10 years, 15 years ago, but then it will come back to bite you after 20 years also. So this was a 32-weeker delivered by LSCS in a nursing home, which did not have NICU facilities. So they shifted the baby to an NICU for 27 days, and attended and follow-up visits were done for so many days. The mother noticed a white reflex after about 6 to 7 months, and then it was diagnosed with stage 5 ROP. So this is what the doctor, the ophthalmologist, has written in April. Seen by so-and-so doctor, no ROP, reviewed 2 weeks and has been signed. So this is totally inadequate. So what the observation of the court was, the responsibility of recognition of infants for screening lies with the pediatrician. So that way we are safe. We are ophthalmologists. So the onus of this comes into the pediatric category and the hospital. Now, suppose you are attached to some hospital and you're on their payroll, then you will be the second person who will be in the lawsuit. And ROP is a teamwork of pediatricians, ophthalmologists, and the nurses also. So if there is no proper medical documentation, then it means that you have not seen the baby properly. So as per the reference, what we want to know is that the examination should have been performed and the retina should have been examined. So you should have examined with indirect ophthalmoscope, with dilatation of the pupil, with scleral depression. So these are the things that were not mentioned in the notes of the doctor. So 64 lakhs is the compensation which the hospital and the doctor had to pay. 31-weeker delivered by LSCS in NICU for 5 weeks, screened at day 8 after birth. But after 3 months of discharge was diagnosed with stage 5. So day 8 is not adequate. This is not when we want to screen the babies. We want to screen the babies by day 21 to 28. And the discharge summary did not mention that the baby had to be screened for ROP. So when you are examining the babies in the NICU, it is your responsibility to mention when the next examination is due, when the screening is due. 7.5 lakhs is also not a small sum of matter. So this was the compensation ordered for this child. So 30-weeker NICU stay for 24 days, follow-up done, noticed, stage 5 ROP after 4 months. Now what? The documentation of the eye examination, it was said WNL. So you cannot say WNL when you have to do all these things as mentioned in the previous case. So compensation of 5 lakhs was awarded and the pediatrician was held liable. So these are all the different cases which have come to light in this manner, and the compensation awarded are not in a very tiny fraction of sum of these are few lakhs of rupees to crores of rupees. So most of the time you have the pediatrician as the main litigant, but then you have the ophthalmologist as the second in command who's going to get sued. So the onus of screening lies with the pediatrician, the NICU, but the negligence is of the hospital. So the MD, the dean of the hospital is liable, and also the pediatric department along with the NICU. Co-liability with ophthalmologist occurs if you have not examined the child properly or you have some lacunae in your documentation. So what has to be done is that the screening has to be done by a pediatric ophthalmologist, preferably who is well versed with indirect ophthalmology with sufficient expertise in staging ROP. This is what the court wants. So it is not necessary that you have to be either a pediatric ophthalmologist or a retinal surgeon. If you have sufficient experience with indirect and ROP, you can screen the babies. So what's lacking? Even Dr. Ashish mentioned that communication is the key. So if you don't communicate with the parents, with the neonatologist, you're in deep soup. So first communicate, update the parents about each and every visit so that they know that you're come and seen the child. Otherwise, they think that nobody has seen. In the NICU, you come and you go, the parents don't know that you've come and gone. And explain the risk of the poor visual outcomes in severe case. Keep harping on that. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 can become blind. And there should be communication with the NICU also. You should be very clear what the criteria for screening are. And if discharged before healing of ROP, ensure follow-up examination. That's very, very important. And information should be in writing also. That is most important. If in doubt, Dr. Ashish has also mentioned, call for second opinion, document everything, transfer it to into an NICU which can treat ROP. Pediatricians, we should be very careful that they are unaware of ROP, screening protocols, etc., etc. So this is our job to enlighten them. Ophthalmologists, we are trying to enlighten them. So if you are not well versed with your ROP screening, please do not do it. Thank you. So the next topic which we have is how to avoid legalities in VR practice. So Dr. Sarvesh is going to talk to us about that. Dr. Sarvesh, as we all know, is a wonderful vitreoretinal surgeon practicing full-time at Bacholi Hospital. Along with that, he visits almost all the other corporate hospitals all over Bombay. And he has had, again, a lot of experience. So whatever he says, again, it's coming along with his years of experience. Over to you, Dr. Sarvesh.
Thank you so much, sir. So after going with Dr. Ashish and Anand sir's presentation, I think half of my job is already done. So going with those broad outlines, I would say that while dealing with a patient and to avoid medical legalities in VR practice, we need to have a two-pronged approach. First, which is effective counseling of the patients, since we all know that VR is a field with in which most of the patients are assured about a guarded prognosis. We don't have excellent results, the pathology itself being responsible to a great extent. Apart from that, a meticulous preparation with documentation is also required in order to achieve a good outcome, so that you don't have to answer the patient later on at the end of the procedure or surgery. So going ahead with that, regarding the preoperative counseling, we have to remember that we have to let the patient know and explain him that what to expect after the surgery. There should be no preconceived notion and no unrealistic expectations, especially in diseases involving the vitreoretina. We have to tell the patient clearly that vitreoretina surgery is like repairing the tissue and not replacing it, unlike cataract, where you replace it with a new intraocular lens. All the procedures right from the post-operative prolonged convalescent period, along with delayed improvement in vision, have to be taken into account in the counseling even before the surgery has started. We need to have empathy with the patient and not pity on him. Many times, most of the patients of VR have taken multiple opinion everywhere, and they have already in a very different state of mind when they come to us. So these are very difficult situations which have to be handled very skillfully. We have to remember that we have to talk in a very simple language and use very appropriate words. You have to always base your language on the cognitive ability of the patient and to avoid information overload, especially in patients who are not very well educated and village folks. There are certain warning signs, like if the patient is trying to badmouth another previous surgeon whom he has consulted, or he's trying to praise you too much even before he's seen your skills and all. These are red flag signs. You have to be very careful about with such patients. Always make sure that you include the caretaker in the conversation and avoid phone calls during discussion, as they show lack of empathy to the patient. There should be no loose talk or any casual discussion if the patient or the relatives are inside the examination room. Even with the colleagues, you should not discuss the case if the patient is in front of you. So having done this, now once you have advised a procedure or a surgery to a patient, make sure that you do a very meticulous job before going ahead with the procedure or surgery. In case of, especially in the case of old patients, because as VR problems are usually seen in geriatric population, these population usually are diabetics, hypertensive, ischemic heart disease. So a thorough physician or anesthetic evaluation prior to surgery is a must. That also applies to children, because these children have to go under general anesthesia, as most of the surgeries are prolonged. So they have to have a thorough GA fitness before the surgery. You have to look at the patient as a whole, like if they have general systemic disabilities like scoliosis, kyphosis, congestive heart failure, if patient is having excess of head nodding, is a patient of COPD, these things have to be taken into account before putting the patient on the surgery table, because they are ultimately going to affect your surgical outcome, even in the terms of time taken, also in the term of the difficulty level. Externally, always see the patient even before the patient places his chin on the slit lamp. See whether the patient is having any adnexal abnormalities like ptosis or any exophthalmos or any squint and all, because these things are going to give you problems during the surgical time. Always do a preoperative fundus photo, especially in a patient who are involved in medical legal cases. This is for documentation and also for patient awareness regarding the need for surgical intervention. A patient who can see his fundus is more better convinced than a patient who hears about it. Also, the fundus photo acts like a comparative tool to show the post-surgical outcome to the patient when you compare it with the pre-surgical records. Make sure that you do a B-scan to the patient in which the fundus is not visible, because it gives you a lot of information. Like there could be a CD hidden with an RD. Where you thought there is a vitreous hemorrhage, there could be an RD and underlying that. Also, it gives us information about the presence of posterior vitreous detachment, and if a TRD is there, what is the configuration of the TRD. These are a few of the examples in which a B-scan gives you an invaluable information. And careful preoperative slit lamp evaluation. Once the patient is on the slit lamp, look for any infective adnexal lesions like chalazions, ties, or conjunctivitis. Look for any NVI, especially in diabetic cases when you are operating on them, because the presence of NVI would suggest chronic detachment or a bad prognosis post-operatively. Obviously, look for any iris colobomas and always check for the extent of cataract, because eventually that is going to hamper your view during the surgery and result into a bad or a difficult outcome post-surgery. If possible, always do a gonioscopy yourself. This is for all the retinal surgeons. This is to look for any hidden NVAs or an angle recession post-trauma, because many times otherwise post-surgery, we will not know why the patient's pressure is high when he must be having a pre-existing angle recession. Also look for goniosynovial and chronic uveitis cases. Presence of significant pterygium, scleral thinning, especially before buccal surgeries, is required, because that makes us in deciding whether to put or not to put a buccal. Also, presence of any corneal pathologies which compromise the fundus view, presence of corneal graft, these things also need to be evaluated thoroughly before surgery. Preoperative OCT is indispensable, especially in cases of like macular hole, where it not only gives you the size, but also helps in deciding the prognosis post-operatively. The type of the ERM can also be documented on OCT, the foveal involvement, the degree of vitreomacular traction, and sometimes intraoperative OCT, if available, is great, as it helps as an important tool in assisting ILM peeling during the surgery. There is a lot of confusion regarding stopping of blood thinners, which most of the people have in mind. So it has been clearly documented that aspirin can be continued, but warfarin needs to be stopped minimum 3 days prior to patients with low thromboembolic risk. It can be resumed, however, after the day of surgery. Heparin-free dialysis is required for patients of chronic kidney disease. Anticoagulation effect of heparin is short-lived, and it can be stopped 6 hours before surgery in high-risk patients. Patients on anti-cancer drugs, however, need to be stopped at least 1 week before surgery. And patients who are on alpha blockers like terazosin, tamsulosin need to be stopped at least 1 week prior to the surgery to prevent difficult pupillary dilation during surgery. Same way, patients who are present to you with choroidal detachment along with retinal detachment need to be started on systemic steroids. Systemic steroids suppress the inflammatory reaction and fluid extravasation from the choroidal blood vessels, leading to a reduction in the CTs. Also, steroids reduce the cellular proliferation and inhibit future PVR progression. Same way, you should always look for challenges in pupillary dilatation like small pupil. This could be due to various reasons like posterior synechiae in diabetic patients, chronic uveitis patients. In such patients, better to start them on perioperative ketorolac and always have standby iris hooks and Malunga ring if possible. If the patient is having dense cataract, always counseling the need for a vitrectomy along with a phaco or a lensectomy during the surgery. Same, also look for decompensated corneas, and if present, better to combine such surgeries with a keratoplasty. Intraocular foreign body suspected, better to do a CT scan if you don't have access to a good B scan and whenever in doubt. So finally, scope for improvement, always take back feedback from the patient and peers is invaluable. Remember, do not react and start disagreeing with the patient. Listen to him, have a patient hearing to his complaints. Reflect and reassess yourself in case a patient gets disgruntled with you. Show warmth and empathy, not pity. I repeat, closely observe your seniors and peers and follow a professional attitude, because finally it's your seniors from whom you learn how to deal with such difficult situations. So finally, a thorough counseling with an empathetic approach, evaluation and adequate preparation prior to a retinal surgery is essential for ensuring a satisfying post-surgical outcome and a happy patient. So raise your words, not the voice, as it's the rain that grows flowers, not thunder. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarvesh. Thank you for that wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
I think whoever is in Mumbai, I think if we want a second opinion, then the patient should definitely go to Ragini madam, because that will always save us from most of these medical legal implications.
Yes, indeed, sir. Indeed.
So I would now like to call upon Dr. Sabri Desai. She is the Chief Oculoplasty Orbit.
Thank you, Anand.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anand. No, I know how caring you are for the patients. Anand, you remember that child?
Yes. Child is doing well now.
Can I interrupt you for a minute? Thank you for this wonderful course. Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Ashish, Sabri, Dr. Sarvesh, Dr. Ajay Sharma. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for having us here. And
thank you. No, medical legal courses are important, because if these are conducted, then it's less headache on my head. And so is head.
Okay, should I start?
Let me introduce you properly. Dr. Sabri is the Senior Oculoplasty, Orbit and Ocular Oncology Surgeon at PG Hinduja Hospital in Mahim, Mumbai. She has done her prestigious fellowship from LV Prasad Eye Institute, Hyderabad. And she's going to enlighten us with what all we should avoid while doing cosmetic surgery in the eyes and the face. Over to you, Sabri.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Dr. Ragini, Dr. Lhane, and the whole MOS team. And thanks, Anand. I think this was an excellent IC, and I also actually ended up learning a lot from this. So, and I'm going to share that with you all. Okay.
You can see your screen.
Yes. I think I just put my video off. Okay. So a lot has been already covered. So my topic is basically careful cosmesis, safeguarding against medical legal issues in oculoplasty. So oculoplasty is kind of a marriage between a plastic surgeon, an oncosurgeon, a trauma surgeon, or a plastic surgeon, and an infectious disease surgeon. So it's kind of, we're doing multiple things and kind of all around the eye. So it is territories that we feel is very defined, but we may be crossing over other territories. Okay. So I would like to acknowledge Dr. Suganti Iyer, who's our Deputy Director at Hinduja, who has over the years really taught us a lot of things and helped us fine tune a lot of our medical legal issues. So what do we need to know? So firstly, I think that everybody hears about this, that someone's been, had some negligence or something, and there's in the paper some facelift or something is goes wrong, and we all read it, especially because these are high profile people, or there's plastic surgeon charged with something. And it's not just abroad, but even in India that we see that plastic surgeries, especially now that with social media, it's the young and what we used to think once upon a time, the low income people who also want a certain way of lifestyle and looks. And even those people come with a lot of expectation. So most of this has Ashish covered this a little bit, quite well, but I'm going to break it down the way I learned it over the years. Was some of the medical legal jargon was negligence. Simply put, it is when accepted protocols and accepted procedures of the specialty supported by textbooks and articles and the associations, when it is not followed, then it is considered as negligence. Then you can have a litigation, such as if the patient feels that there was an undercorrection of surgery, failure to meet desired results, or unwarranted complications which they felt were not explained, can result in a litigation from the patient to the defendant, which is us, and then a compensation. So what it basically involves is a person who's low income may not want such a high compensation, or one may not even go down this path. But people who are usually high profile and have a large income will require or want a high compensation. So it all starts in the OPD, and this is a very simple thing, but for oculoplastic surgery, as is for other things, it's really, really important. So documentation while you're doing clinical evaluation. So a simple thing is something like drawing notes. So if you look at this is an eyelid tumor, and this is what I've drawn, and this is what the patient has, and it's pretty close. And I am fussy about the way this is done. We encourage our residents to document, because even if suppose you don't have a photograph and you've documented it so well, it saves you a lot of trouble in the future. But now it's not as simple as cornea or retina or anterior segment, where you can take a picture like this and you don't really have to worry about so much of a consent because nothing is disclosed. But if I show you the same picture in a perspective from an oculoplastic surgeon, the whole thing changes and the entire ball game is different, because you can identify the person and the person's face. So similarly here, this is not the same patient and here, but you can identify. So what you need to do is basically photography also highlights during oculoplastic surgery the problems and the issues when you're dealing and counseling a patient, such as this lady, for example, who came with the complaint of right eye appearing bigger, and she's right, she has eyelid retraction, but she also thought that basically she felt that her face was looking a little bit odd, and she was right, but she couldn't figure out why. And before we went into this surgery and she wanted a full correction of her eye, the main thing was to point out that she had a significant facial asymmetry, where there was a sort of a flattening of the malar eminence and the jaw was slightly flattened. So we needed to point this out because she felt that this was causing the asymmetry in the face, which was not the case. Similarly, this gentleman came with a history of drooping when kept insisting that his eye was looking down, but it was a simple case of the fact that it was not the eyelid, but the eyebrow. So simple things like this, if you don't point it out early on, you're going to land up in a soup. After clinical evaluation, documentation is counseling notes. So in oculoplastic surgery, you must write things like you've counseled them about loss of vision, transient vision loss, or even as something as what I pointed out, where I've written is discussed with patients regarding possibility of 2 surgeries along with signatures taken. Now, you don't want to scare them off and say, sign here, sign there with so many consents. But I think it's about counseling them in a way, saying that we've explained this to you so that there is an understanding between us. We're just kind of putting it down on paper to know. Sometimes some people can be a little, I would say, a little hostile if you've been very cut and dry and not explained, but most often they're willing to sign. Coming to consent, and this has already been spoken, but I just want to highlight what occurs in oculoplasty is, before that, photographic consent is an absolute must. You cannot escape this. Now, there are lots of articles about plastic surgery and photography consent, but what I want to highlight is that there are a couple of articles, this written by Dr. Bipasha from Shankar Netralaya and Akshay. It basically talks about actually what you need to do. So it says that the consent includes a statement of understanding that the photographs are part of the patient's medical record for purposes of medico-legal documentation. and can be used for educational purposes, lectures, exhibits, and publication. And informed consent for publication is necessary. So this is something we take as soon as the patient comes in our OPD. We have it attached into the file, so it's done simultaneously. We also have it in Marathi so that it can be done, and we don't have one in Hindi, but we have one in English, and it's explained, but ideally you should have it in every language. So this is one which was there in the IGO in the same issue. And there are many. You can modify this to what suits you, which is what we've done. Similarly, consent for oculoplastic surgeries. Now, this is for exenteration, which is a surgery which came, I mean, everybody's heard about it, especially with the mucormycosis crisis, that it's something which is so disfiguring. It's not a cosmetic surgery, but even in this, we had to explain what it was, that eye will be removed, everything will be removed, there'll be no lashes. And along with this, we write additional comments, risk explained in any, and we fill and we write here, and we take additional signatures where we have made any additional notes. Once you have written something in a consent form, try not to change or scratch anything, which most of us know, but especially in oculoplasty consent, you have to be very, explicit in explaining this and taking a counter signature. Often because it can be subjective, oculoplasty, and especially hardcore cosmetic surgery, and the patient's expectations may have not matched, or there may be a misunderstanding. Just talking about experimental and research consent and protocols, you need to get ethics review if you're involving them in some study. This is something also we learned, that you have to, it's good to be associated. I think Ashish mentioned this, with some associations. It helps you, if there is any litigation. Insurance, this is a rough idea of the insurance. It depends on the years of practice. I'll just give me another 30 seconds to a minute. So it will be less than 5 years is about 25 lakh, 5 to 10 years, 50, more than 10 years is 1 crore. And if you have a very high profile practice, then even early on, you can have about 2 to 5 crores, especially in plastic surgery. How much the patient earns also depends on the litigation and how high they will ask for compensation, as is based on the type of clientele. Documentation should be preserved at least for a minimum of 5 years, but ideally it should be at least for 10 years. And with EMR now that's changed, but with those who don't have EMR, you must consider retaining it. I found this very nice article, I found this very nice article in the Oculoplastic Reconstructive Journal, which is the official journal. And I'm just going to take you through this very quickly. It was only oculoplastic surgeries which had litigation and malpractice. And it was from 1988 to 2012, which is a good enough time. And the commonest litigated surgical procedures were blepharoplasty and brow lift, which is true because it can cause over and under correction. The most people who were litigated were plastic surgeons with 46%, and fellowship trained oculoplastic surgeons. Now this itself is a little old, it's 2017, and I'm sure as the number of plastic surgeons increase, this increases. But what was really important is that the number of defendants that in favor of defendant was also very high, almost 60% in favor of the doctors. But the two main reasons, and this is really the take-home message, is that what they complained about was the lack of informed consent, and as high as 30%, and the need for additional surgery was not explained in almost 40%. So take-home message is oculoplastic surgery should be treated like plastic surgery. Ensure yourself and be aware, and learn the legal implications prior to going ahead with anything, as knowledge is always information and power. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabri. So that's what we've come to expect out of you, a crisp presentation covering all the points. Thank you very much for that. We'll now go on to what is bothering all of us, and maybe not the super specialists, but all ophthalmologists, premium IOL practice. So we have none other than Dr. Ajay Sharma. He's a practicing ophthalmologist and the medical director of Amber Eye Care at Thane. And he's been into practice for more than 20 years. And now his keen interest is in refractive cataract. So I have heard this for some time, but now this is gaining more and more acceptance, refractive cataract. And he has performed over 2,500 toric IOL surgeries in the past 5 years. And he is happily sitting and chatting with us, which means that he does not have any litigation against him. So I would invite Dr. Ajay Sharma for his talk. Over to you, Dr. Ajay. We can't hear you, Ajay. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Anand, and thank you, Moss, for giving me the opportunity to discuss medical legal aspects of premium IOL. Today, cataract surgery is a refractive surgery, and there is an increased demand for freedom from glasses. Open the door. So how do we change? Definition of premium IOLs has been changing over a period of time. Earlier on, aspheric lenses are considered premium. Right now, our current definition would include all presbyopic correcting implants, which are multifocals, trifocal, EDOF lenses, and also toric monofocal lenses. The issues with premium IOLs is that these presbyopic correcting IOLs are not covered, fully covered in your insurance scheme. So there is an out-of-pocket expense for the patient. And because the patient is paying more, the expectations are also more. They expect perfect, unaided, near and distant vision, and there's no IOL which can provide that. The medical legal issues has been discussed by earlier speakers. The lawsuits is always the perception of negligence and not enough care. And the malpractice suits in cataract surgery occurs when there is a patient doesn't see well and the surgeon was not caring or communicating enough. Whatever lawsuits that occur in premium IOLs most of them will occur in routine cataract surgery also. So the basic causes will be a posterior capsular end with a retained lens matter, if not referred on time. So the key is not referred on time to a retinal surgeon. Corneal edema, which leads to pseudophakic bullous keratopathy. If the patient has fuchs in the other eye and not been documented, not been picked up, can be a deficiency in service. Endophthalmitis, if there is a delay in diagnosis, the key is the delay. So if the patient calls up and says pain and redness after cataract surgery, and the doctor just advises him to change medications on the phone, since it's a weekend, so if the patient comes later with proper hypopia and end off and loses the eye, he can sue the doctor that there was a delay in diagnosis, which led to the loss of vision. And similarly, mixed glaucomas or secondary glaucoma result in visual field loss can lead to litigation. Wrong eye operated or CAT surgery leading to detachment will cause litigation. But in addition to this, in premium IOL, what else can be considered a deficiency of service? If the doctor is using a multifocal lens for a patient, but using outdated formula and biometry, this is definitely a deficiency of service. And not treating preoperative astigmatism, significant astigmatism, and putting a multifocal lens can also be considered a deficiency of service. Inadequate preoperative counseling regarding the limitation of premium lenses and missing preoperative ocular diagnosis, which result in poor post-op vision, and not doing the peripheral retinal examination for a clear lens exchange in a young myope who has a high risk of RD can all be a deficiency of service. For multifocal IOLs, it's best to have a special consent. Whatever counseling we are doing to the patient has to be written. So where different lenses options are explained and written, the complications of multifocal IOLs are explained, and the financial obligations. That means the patient will have an out-of-pocket expense. The insurance company will not fully reimburse the multifocal lens, has to be written and documented. The preoperative counseling is the most crucial step. This will increase the chair time with a prospective refractive cataract patient and more time and attention than any other cataract surgery that you're doing. Once the patient is convinced about and wants to do a refractive cataract surgery and comes to you, he's highly motivated because he's been spoken to by the counselor. But the job of the doctor is to tell him that we will try to, the object of the surgery is to restore all or most of the near focusing ability of the eye, but there are post-operative outcomes may not meet his expectation. Then there's going to be no guarantee because the IOL position, the wound healing, the calculations all play a part in this. The limitations of IOLs have to be explained to the patient, that he will not get clear vision for all distances, may need glasses for crisp and clear vision, because refractive cataract surgery is not freedom from glasses, but to reduce his dependence on glasses, just like a LASIK surgery. And there will be a need for second procedure. This has to be explained to the patient. At the same time, the side effects of presbyopia-correcting lenses has to be explained, that there's going to be less sharp vision compared to a monofocal lens, a compromised vision in dim light, halos, decreased contrast, and can all result in difficulty in driving at night. Alternate options of multifocal IOLs have to be discussed with the patient. The need for secondary procedure, especially in toric implants, has to be told to the patient. It can be just one simple sentence that we are implanting a toric lens, will reduce your astigmatism. But some few patients need a little touch up because the lens can rotate within the first few hours after surgery, and between 10 to 14 days, we need to touch up the eye to correct that lens. This is enough, so the patient, once has a refractive surprise, is not really worried. Laser correction, vision correction for residual refractive error, and very rarely an alignment. Procedure has to be explained to the patient. If any intraoperative complication occurs, a monofocal lens would be used. This has to be mentioned to the patient. The preoperative evaluation has to be similar to a LASIK patient. So we have to do a topography. And if the patient is not a good candidate for a laser vision correction, then we have to explain to the patient that if there's a refractive error postoperatively, he will not have much options but to wear glasses. The optical biometry obviously is a must. The key is not to miss any retinal pathologies which lead to poor vision postoperatively. So AMD, ARM, DMR, glaucoma, corneal dystrophy. If we operate a premium on these patients and not inform the patient, that can be considered deficiency of service. So a checklist in all premium patients would include a potential acuity meter, OCT of the macula, and topography. Any patient who has untreated dry eye diseases, CNS medication, depressed, or uncomfortable with out-of-pocket expenses has to be excluded. So some patients who may have a good result postoperatively, but still going to be unhappy are the patients who are high demanding vision, like lawyers, surgeons, drivers, and doctors shopping patient who insist on a particular brand and are particular about the aisle cost and have unrealistic visual expectations. Especially patients who are rude to your staff, we need to be careful about these. So the doctors have to train the staff to handle patient complaint calls, inform the doctor whenever there's an unreasonable or rude patient in the OPD. Most patients behave differently in front of the doctor, but doctors need to learn to listen to the staff, because those are the red flags for you. If you have an unhappy patient, do not be defensive, do not be dismissive, understand the nature of complaint, because most issues improve over time, but accurate documentation of all unhappy patients. So accurate notes have to be written. The notes should be, as we said, just not retina is normal, but a dilated peripheral retina evaluated with depression. In all patients who are myopes, who are going refractive lens exchange, a depression, indirect ophthalmology with a depression was carried out, has to be mentioned. So I'll just wind up. So consent will not prevent claim or damages, but it is essential, and thorough consent discussions before surgery should be taken, not on the day of surgery, but prior to it. And accurate and contemporaneous documentation in unhappy patients. When complications arise, surgeons should handle them in accordance with best practices and refer patients appropriately. Staff training is important in attending to patient calls. Implement safety protocols for intraocular lens and follow carefully some guidelines while billing. So especially patients who are not fully covered. And whenever there is going to be a financial statement, it's best to take a legal advice before approaching a financial settlement with the patient. Thank you so much, Anand.
Thank you, Dr. Ajay, for that wonderful presentation. I think the take-home point from all the talks is that we should have a clear communication with the patients. So if we can communicate what we are trying to do in a language which they understand, I think most of the battles are won. So for the lack of time, I don't think we'll be taking any questions. So I'd like to thank all my fellow instructors, Dr. Ajay, Dr. Ashish, Dr. Savri, Dr. Sarvesh, for this wonderful instruction course. And last but not the least, thank you MOS for having this instruction course over here. Now over to the next session. They can take
Thank you,
over.
sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Anand.